So welcome to this Catholic Investment Services webinar entitled 10 Common Pitfalls of Building Your Catholic Foundation and How to Address Them. This is a follow-up from the session we had a couple of months ago. We had so many good questions and so much feedback that we decided to hold this second webinar on Catholic Foundations topic. Today's session, participants can ask questions throughout the session. So please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. Our audience is muted, and this webinar is going to be recorded, like I said, and it's going to be on our podcast called Sustainable Grace. My name is Zela Astarjian, and I'm a managing director at Catholic Investment Services, and I'm going to be your host today. Enormous thank you to our accomplished panelists who you're going to meet shortly. Catholic Investment Services was founded by some of the investment industry's most respected leaders to address the investment challenges faced by Catholic organizations. We are a Catholic nonprofit helping other nonprofits access sophisticated institutional strategies without sacrificing alignment. You received biographical information on our speakers, but I want to emphasize a few highlights. Paulita Pike represents mutual funds and their boards, as well as investment advisors throughout the country, and works with such industry leaders as Invesco, Prudential, Northern Trust, and Calamos. She also shapes the next generation of legal minds by serving as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Notre Dame. Paulita is also a trustee at Catholic Investment Services, and of course, she's a managing partner at the Chicago office of Ropes and Gray. She's passionately devoted to the arts. Paulita has served on the executive committee and president of the auxiliary board of the Art Institute of Chicago, and has also served as a trustee of the Institute, and she's also been very involved on the board of directors at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater. Elizabeth Tomlin is general counsel at the Archdiocese of the Military. She has extensive expertise in nonprofit management and growth. She has served as general counsel for the Archdiocese of the Military Services since 2016. Elizabeth has particular expertise in establishing religious affiliated nonprofits and charitable foundations, and as an Army spouse, she has served as a consultant for numerous military-affiliated nonprofits to improve corporate governance, fundraising, donor relationship, and strategic communications. When she's not practicing law, Elizabeth writes for Ave Maria Press. She is the author of Joyful Momentum. She's also currently a candidate for a master's degree in theology at the University of Notre Dame. John Schlageter is a managing partner at JKT Group, which is a consulting firm that specializes in the operation and growth of charitable organizations. A lawyer by trade and practice, John is an expert in the administration and development of religious charitable trusts and foundations, and provides executive director services to a number of firms' clients. John was the first executive director at Bethlehem University Foundation and served there for 9 years as general counsel at the Archdiocese of Military Services also. In addition to his work at JKT, John is general counsel at the Eparchy of St. Maroon of Brooklyn and the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, and serves on a number of charitable boards. John is a native of Hollywood, Florida, and lives in DC with his 2-year-old son and their poodle, Lena. Last but not least, Corey Howard is the executive director at Catholic Community Foundation of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. He has an extensive background working in nonprofits, including development side of the mission. Corey is a native of New Orleans. His business background started when he and an associate established the Smoothie King franchises in the Las Vegas Valley. This motivated Corey to take some of the entrepreneurial expectations of the business industry into the nonprofit sector. His nonprofit development experience broadened as the executive director for the Boys Hope, Girls Hope, where he served for over 9 years. During this time, Corey co-founded Alive in You and National Catholic Youth Conference. And Corey today serves as the president of I Give Catholic, which is a U.S. Catholic Church's Giving Day. Before I turn this over to our moderator, Paulita Pike, Elizabeth Tomlin is going to lead us with a short prayer.
This is from today's readings, actually. So we pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. From today's psalm, our God is the God of salvation. God arises, his enemies are scattered, and those who hate him flee before him. But the just rejoice and exult before God. They are glad and rejoice. Our God is the God of salvation. Amen. Father, and Son, and Spirit.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you, Zela, for the really terrific introduction. So, as Zela noted, today's webinar is the second one that we are conducting on broad-based governance principles relating to establishing and growing a Catholic foundation. This second webinar came about as a result of really terrific feedback and engagement following the first webinar. So thank you so much for all your suggestions. And we hope that the topics that Corey, Elizabeth, Zela, John, and I are going to address today are helpful. Also, we really do hope you will keep the feedback coming, because what interests us is to be useful to you. And it's really much easier to program topics that we know are of interest to you. So with that, let's get started. As the title of the webinar notes, we are going to be exploring 10 common pitfalls associated with establishing a foundation. We are not going to spend the same amount of time on each, as we believe that some topics actually deserve a deeper dive than others, but we really do invite your questions in the chat function. We hope you will submit them. And if for some reason we don't get to all of them, they will probably be the starting point for thinking about our next webinar. So thank you in advance for all that. Okay, with that, let's dive right in. Corey, let's begin with you. Pitfall number 1, not defining your mission. What is that all about?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Paulita. And thanks for Catholic Investment Services bringing us together. You know, as part of this, just want to claim a thank you for this space to be able to not assume anything here, and to be able to go back, as we talk about the ABCs, and start talking these things to say, look, it's never not only affirming enough to be able to address this, but great for this conversation ahead. So I'm honored to be a part of this. So thank you all. You know, when we talk about mission and we talk about foundations, it's quite interesting how quick, not only in the nonprofit world, but specifically in the Catholic foundation world, that mission drift can happen. And recognizing how mission drift, if we're going to talk about pitfalls, how money sometimes can drag us into places that we don't want to go if we're not intentional. And so, interesting enough, I think the part of the pitfall here for us was to really go back and to be able to stay focused on mission. We had a great example of our leader at the time, our board chair, that said, look, when we were doing our long-range planning as a foundation, and at the time, we were looking and exploring this idea of rebranding to the Catholic Community Foundation. So we're just adding one word, interesting enough, community. But what we did is we went back and broke apart for an entire day out of the day and a half that we set aside for our board to be able to explore what it is inside of our core, what's our core mission, and to be able to really examine each word of our mission. And to be able to, as a foundation and as a board, make sure that we were rooted directly into that mission conversation, that every word mattered, and that we would use that basically as the litmus test for our continued operations. That when we would go back and lean on the words that we created that day were not only intentional, but they were very purposeful in the way that we tried to be able to interact on a day-to-day basis. And so I would say that it really goes back to our core mission and your core mission, to be able to not have a pitfall to say, oh yeah, we have a mission statement, but to really be rooted in that, and to be able to know that each word matters, and that those documents become literally etched in stone for you to be able to not stray from your mission, but to go back to that when you have questions of ethics or mission drift, that you could say, you know what, we spent this time back in, for us, 2019, to be able to say these words matter to us, And for us, it's really inspiring. And as a leader of a foundation, to be able to lean on that. So it's not just me, Corey Howard, making it up. It's the foundation driving that forward through its mission work.
Corey, that is super helpful. So it's not just about defining what the mission is right at the start, but keep coming back to that intentionally. And that makes a lot of sense. So Elizabeth, when we think about how that might be reflected then in governance documents, I assume that one of the ways in which a foundation or a board can remind itself to keep coming back to the mission is in fact to embed it into documents, its governing documents. How do you think about that?
I couldn't agree more with you. You know, Article 1 in any of your governing documents is often purpose. What is your purpose? And that's a great place to define the mission of what you do. So John and I work between the Military Archdiocese and the St. John the 23rd Foundation. And within the Military Archdiocese, our mission is to serve a certain population of people. So we are a personal archdiocese. So the people served by this archdiocese are members of the military and veterans and civilian employees working overseas. Within the foundation, we broadened the mission of that foundation a little so that it could serve Catholics in the armed forces and the military, but in a broader way that might be beyond the military archdiocese. So that within the foundation, they're holding funds for seminarian support, for example, retirement funds, and then could support other Catholic initiatives that serve the military. But where that was established was in the governing documents of the entities from the beginning. And when you have those documents that are clear and that people can reference back to, it gives a grounding point. Like Corey was saying, sometimes you can drift from your mission based on where the funding is. And it's these governing documents are an important place to be able to go back and reference and say, okay, is this the mission of what we do? And if not, perhaps we can, facilitate this donor or this initiative to an entity that would be more suitable.
Thank you. So the discussion of governing documents then I think easily lends itself to discussing, John, some of the legal aspects of this. Not all governing documents are driven by law, but some of them are. And what are the legal implications, or how do you see mission playing out in the legal aspects of this foundation?
Thank you, Paulita. And again, I echo Corey's words of thanks to Catholic Investment Services for allowing us to speak to you today. I have a number of clients at my firm, and we deal with all types of nonprofits, and we put them back on track. But quite often, Catholic and other religious nonprofits go off the rails because no one has bothered to read their bylaws. And in many cases, the bylaws and the articles of incorporation were something that was drafted 40 years ago by some lawyer who pulled out a form and filled out the names and whited out some things and etched a few things into the document, and no one's really cared. And because of that, these well-intentioned boards will get away from what the actual mission of the institution was. I don't want to get too much into details, but some clients think that they're the governing organization for the entity that they're supposed to be underwriting, and that's not the case at all. And I think that we've seen a number of Catholic charities, especially larger ones, and I won't name any as well, that started making grants outside of their jurisdiction and outside of the requirements of their bylaws. And those institutions had to do quite a bit of cleanup for a few years after making grants that were outside of their scope. I'm a firm believer that if the road to hell is paved with good intentions, the road to heaven is paved with a good audit and a good governance committee.
That's terrific. Okay, so mission in everything, and it seems sort of fundamental, but it also sounds like there are plenty of examples out there to show that people can drift, foundations can drift, and it's important that the mission be at the core of everything. John, since you're already on the hot seat, let's dive into pitfall number 2, which is that not having adequate staffing. How do you think of staffing?
Well, I think of staffing, and I think of two separate institutions. If you're creating a foundation or a trust, that is driven by any number of issues, but the primary among them is asset protection. And in order to have good asset protection, you need good separation, that wall of separation between the foundation or trust or other entity and the beneficiary organization. We don't want any piercing of the corporate veil for the lawyers out there. And so the easiest way to entangle your Catholic nonprofit with the beneficiary is to have the same staff. And it's a very delicate and sometimes difficult situation where the CFO of the diocese is also the CFO of the foundation or the trust, or the executive director of the foundation is also the director of development of the diocese. If you're going to do this right, do it right from the beginning. Make sure that the foundation has its own independent staff, its own independent governance, and that the boards are not your board of the foundation is not your diocesan board or your apostolate's board, and make sure that the problem with adequate staffing, I know a lot of these institutions are rather small and the funds are not there, but you can hire part-time staff. You can hire the whole basis of my firm, and we're not the only ones out there, is there are organizations that farm out their executive director services. You want to keep those lines clear. And I'll stop because I know that Corey and Elizabeth have thoughts on this as well.
Elizabeth.
Sure. Adequate staffing kind of butts up against the place where people want to do good work and then also capacity build, but you have to invest in timely and adequate staffing in order to grow. I've seen so many nonprofits or small entities, small foundations that have relied on one person and a core group of volunteers to do the professional work of the entity. And the result is that you're only as strong as your weakest volunteer. Whereas if the entity had invested in staffing, it would have avoided the fallout of, volunteers who quit, or lack of continuity, lack of hiring people who have the right expertise from the get-go, and have really hindered themselves. So the need to hire timely, while it may seem expensive initially, pays off in spades when you realize the expertise that the person brings to the table, and it just increases your capacity for growth. So, and I would also say not to be afraid of outsourcing. John touched on some foundations who hire their executive director from outside, such as John's firm, and that's important for the executive director and for your legal needs, for finance needs, bookkeeping needs. It's not necessary to keep all of these in staff on W-2 employees, but sometimes if the scale is small enough, outsourcing is a great way to build your foundation in a scale that's economical for you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So what's clear from both your remarks and John's is that volunteers can be helpful, but that it is a pitfall to rely exclusively on volunteers, or too many volunteers, or maybe volunteers in the wrong roles. And I understand how that's a tension, because when something is starting out, the resources aren't necessarily there, but it sounds like you're saying investing in those resources early on is a really critical component. Corey, have you had the same experience, and specifically with respect to volunteers as well?
Yeah, I know probably even many people, once you start claiming this topic, could share war stories about how navigating this can be difficult, and really from multiple levels, and just affirming something that John had said about, hey, you have the same CFO. There is a delineation that does really truly help with that, and to be able to understand takes you being able to back up as a foundation staffer and just say, where are my needs? And probably, like all good things, it's probably a blend that will allow you to understand that we're not saying just get rid of volunteers, right? It's to be able to kind of discern through and say, hey, where's it helpful? Where's it not? Where do I need a staff? Where do I need a 1099 employee? So last year I was faced with a little situation to be able to get our CFO help, and I didn't want to turn to the diocese in this situation necessarily for like, hey, help. So I went to a parish whose staff was kind of leaving and said she wanted to retire, and And really what she wanted was a job that was just 1 day a week. It was perfect for us to help offset our CFO. It's a 1099 employee. So I didn't have the capacity, but I had to be able to go hire full-time staff, but I had the creativity enough to be able to say, hey, go ask, make the invite. I found a 1099 employee. She comes in on Wednesdays and is a perfect person for, we're not there yet for another second full-time accounting staff, but we're not there yet also to just have a volunteer do it. We needed the accountability. And it reminds me of that story, and it's kind of interesting. We needed some legal help, and I thought I could go cheap, and I ended up leaning on a volunteer to be able to do it. And next thing you know, I got a bill in the mail. It was fascinating. I'm like, wait a second, what is this? And it's those kind of stories that you live through that you say, hey, how do I avoid these pitfalls? Being clear on the expectations from the front end of volunteers. How can I help? Okay, what does that look like? And if it does look like this, is this a volunteer service? Asking on the front end removes so many awkward conversations on the back end. And so really trying to avoid those pitfalls by being clear, the expectations, and understanding that you probably will end with a blend of volunteer and staff.
So Corey, we have a few statements in the Q&A, but there is a question. Is it possible if you're a small diocese and beginning a foundation that the foundation signs some kind of agreement of services with the diocese so that financial management or development staff can safely manage while stewarding funds appropriately?
Great question. And the short of it is absolutely. As we know, when you know one diocese, you know one diocese. I mean, it is because of the nature of how CFOs operate, how the infrastructure works. You'd really just have to look at that scale. You could have MOUs or memorandums of understanding for specific tasks. You could have it for specific purposes. I think the clear thing, and I defer to Elizabeth, is to make sure that that is the legal language that really helps define that it's not just a handshake, or it's not over lawyered, and understand what I'm saying, that it's not so restrictive that you're going back and checking for every single thing. Can he do this? Can he do that? You want it to be functional, but you also want it to be clear in the fact that the rollback to the diocese is also just an open communication piece, because it's when the communication doesn't happen that kind of if you will, the weed gets in the crack and then it expands, and then next thing you know, you have a fight on your hands or some disagreement on your hands. And so it can happen, but it is clear to be able to do it, but also not to overdo it, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense, Corey. Thank you. All right, we're going to keep moving. Pitfall number 3, John, we're going to start with you. Apostolates do not have reasonable expectations nor timelines.
Okay, and I just want to follow up with what Corey said about MOUs before we jump into this. I hate MOUs. I think that they're the first thing that any bankruptcy lawyer is going to go look for. So if you're going to draft MOUs, make sure you get them right, because that's going to show up if in any sort of legal situation. And don't have the diocesan attorney draft it, because they're going to entangle you with the diocese. And as much as I enjoy being a diocesan attorney, I believe that I think that this is this is a nice follow-up to the questions we're getting about staff. And if your diocese is going to create a diocesan foundation and they're really going to get it right, you have to understand that this is a major investment from the diocese. You're not just putting your assets into a separate trust, you're building an entity from the ground up. And I think that in most cases, dioceses are not willing to do that. And I think that if you're really serious about building a diocesan foundation, the diocese should expect to make a gift of between $500,000 and $1 million for the first few years of operational costs. There are too many entities out there that just expect, oh, we'll create a foundation and it's going to make lots of money and we'll be able to run operations. I think you really need to invest in the future. You need a good, solid executive director, and the person who builds your entity is not going to be the person who manages your entity. They're two very different skill sets. You need a board of directors that understands their job is to build an entity, not to rubber stamp what the diocese wants. They have to be a self-governing, self-perpetuating board. And I've seen this especially with a number of entities that are looking to fund foreign charities. So many foreign entities believe, oh, we'll just create a foundation in the United States and money will just rain from heaven and we'll get all of these funds back and forth. If you're building an entity that's going to support a foreign charity, it needs 5 years to contemplate its own navel. It needs to grow its assets. It needs to grow its board. I was put on the board of a foreign seminary that was looking to build a foundation in the United States, and I ran my mouth and said, "Look, you need to allow this foundation to grow, to put money in the bank, to grow its investment portfolio." A week later, I was asked off the board, so I guess I did my job by telling them exactly what I thought. But reasonable expectations, and there, I think I'm just going to go off tangent for a second here. If you are running a charity that is supporting foreign entities, the IRS has a number of guidelines that you have to follow about making grants to foreign charities. You can't just, a US taxpayer cannot get a deduction for making a gift to a foreign entity. And so in order for that person to give money to a Friends of organization, the board of directors has to follow a number of rules, and there's a number of things that have to be written into your governing documents about how you support those entities. And if you want, I can actually put a link to the memorandum that the IRS put out about that. But all to say, don't expect to create something in money to rain from heaven. If you're going to build a diocesan foundation, the diocese has to make an investment into it. If you're not willing to make that investment, create a trust and sit on your money. Don't create a foundation that's going to be a self-governing institution. You can create diocesan trusts and park money into the trust as a separate entity. It doesn't need the governing structure of the foundation. But if you're looking to make a foundation that's going to grow assets and fundraise for you, expect 3 to 5 years of growing it. And I'll stop there.
Elizabeth, how do you see the 3 to 5 year proposition, and what does that mean in terms of when you might make a grant to the beneficiary organization?
I think that's a fair question, and I think it depends on each entity and the expectations. So, a concrete example within the St. John the 23rd Foundation, and John, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but within the St. John the 23rd Foundation, they've made this decision to build the foundation before making those grants. However, if you have a small foundation and let's say a mission diocese, then you might have to make grants earlier. And if you do have the luxury of not drawing on an endowment earlier, that's great. But the work we do is mission oriented. The work we do is not to amass a large endowment at the expense of a mission. So it's really a call between the diocese and the supporting foundation.
Great, Elizabeth, thank you. We are going to turn to our pitfall number 4. So we've talked about defining the mission. We've discussed the commitment to adequate staffing up front. We've talked about reasonable expectations and timelines and setting those right at the beginning. Corey, pitfall number 4, when it finally gets to be time to hire, the 4th pitfall is not prioritizing the hires appropriately. And what does that mean to you?
Sorry about that. A little glitch with the thank you. It's a great question, but I think really where it goes on the prioritization of it really starts to be able to understand what John was just talking about. And I think that's one thing that we oftentimes gloss over is just, and it's a segue because all these questions in some way are interconnected, but it really understands to be able to say, what are your priorities for the foundation in growing your mission? And so, example, if you're really trying to be able to help your organization to be a better conduit of parish, say, custodial funds, and you're trying to grow your foundation that way, well, if you have the same CFO as the diocese and you're trying to be able to make that work, well, you could literally build your house on sand in that way, and being able to say, like, you start just, if you will, chasing the money of like, hey, we have parishes that want to park money with us, and you're not really setting yourself up for where a foundation's growth can happen, which is outside donors being able to have a trusted piece to you, trusted piece back to the foundation. And so I think the priority comes when you're able to see what are the things that are really going to help your foundation be solidified for the future. And for me, I know one of those things None of it was ever right until you get your CFO right. And I think that that was, for me, a really guidepost to be able to think through, all right, I could have a great fundraiser, but if the money's parked back into a relationship, that's not going to be able to work. So for us, it became that CFO got elevated to be able to say, we really need this trust more than anything, and that delineation more than anything. And so each one of you, this isn't a directive to those that are on this call to say, just go get you a CFO. Is to be able to say, to understand the importance of each role and to weigh that according to the goals of where you want to grow. And I think in that sense, it helps you to be able to say, yeah, you know what, we have this great dynamic executive director, but if our funds aren't cleaned up on the background, 3 years, funny enough, what John was saying, 3 to 5 years, if you grow a foundation with a dynamic executive director and messy books on the background, it'll take an additional 3 years to clean those up, because of the nature of fund agreements, because of the nature of accounting, because of the nature of a good audit. All those, because of those pieces, can really set you and the foundation's growth back. So you really have to be intentional with what those roles are and what purposes that those staff are going to be able to come in, and they align with your own priorities.
But fundamentally, be really strategic about prioritizing who you're going to hire first and why, and it may be different for different institutions, different foundations. Elizabeth, who do you hire first?
Corey has it right with the CFO. You've got to get your CFO right. But then beyond that, I kind of branch it into aspects of the mission. One would be, who is your major fundraiser, your communicator, your networker, that person who can really do a great job of communicating the mission of what your entity does. And to support that, and equally essential, is your person who understands the details, who understands what gift acceptance policies mean, who understands how to keep the books in-house to continue to facilitate relationships made through annual giving, letter writing, acquisitions. They're two completely different skill sets. And every now and then you can get a great executive director who can do both. But as your entity grows, it's essential to hire those skill sets in balance. And what Corey was saying, you can have somebody great who's communicating the mission, but if your books are a mess behind the scenes, how much are you going to spend and time are you going to have to invest to fix it? So I think you have to grow in balance with these great communicators, these great people who sell the mission, and these phenomenal detail-oriented people who connect the dots. Often unseen, but equally as essential.
So John, Elizabeth, and Corey have touched on the CFO, the numbers person, meaning the CFO, development. How do you see it? And specifically, how do you view the role of the person who's essentially building the foundation compared to the person managing?
I think they're two different people, because I think that they're two very different skill sets. The person who's building the institution from a ground up has to be a visionary who's flying at 30,000 feet. They have to understand donor data, donor relationships. They have to know how to build a board. Building a board is a skill set that is unique. What does your board look like? What do your bylaws look like? How do your committees come together? That's a person who has that expertise in really startups. It's because your foundation is a startup. That person gets 3 to 5 years to start up the organization. And then after that is when you put in the manager, the person who understands the day-to-day governance of this institution and who works with donors to continue to build. But creating that foundation, I think you really need to look at that visionary who has that skill set. One of the things we always say here at the office is, if it didn't happen, if it's not in the database, it didn't happen. So I think one of the things you need from the very beginning is a good database. But I think you need someone. More importantly, I think when you're creating a foundation, you need someone who understands the need to have a separation from the beneficiary organization. Because if you're really interested in asset protection, that you need that person who understands the small steps that you have to take in order to have those separations. And I think one of the biggest things that many structures that many of the clients that I've had is that they don't build their boards correctly. You put the bishop in as the chairman, you put him in as president, you put him in as corporate member, and then you put a few diocesan clerics on the board and maybe 2 or 3 donors, and the foundation never becomes what it's supposed to be. It always just becomes an extension of the bishop's office. I actually can't stand the model where the bishop is the chairman of the board. I think that that's horrendous. I shouldn't say horrendous. It's a way of making sure that your entity doesn't get off the ground. I like the idea. Make the bishop the president, but have the chairman of the board elected every year from among the members, so that the bishop and the chairman or chairperson, the chair of the board, are working side by side. You put your biggest donor in as chair and say, please bring your friends to the table. I think that that's just the better way of making sure that, not only are you hiring the right staff, but you're hiring the right board.
So John, you've taken us into governance, and so I'm going to call governance, or lack of proper governance, pitfall number 5, because it's come up now, and I think it makes sense in the context of this discussion. Elizabeth, how do you view, what can go wrong with governance, sort of picking up on what John said, and how is that a pitfall?
Sure. I think one of the aspects of governance that you have to think of when you have oftentimes a board of professionals, CPAs and attorneys and very skilled people on your board, is who's governing your board and then who's managing your entity. And so one thing that John, Corey, and I talk about frequently is that oftentimes your lawyer on your board must understand that the lawyer on your board is not the lawyer for your organization. And that the role of your board members as fiduciaries is different than the role of your professional staff who manages your entity. And so having that right from the start is incredibly important. And it's also protective of your board members, so that your board members are doing the good work that they do in relationship building, in helping to guide the vision, and not getting into the weeds, especially in small entities, of falling into the situation where you have a working board that's running your entity. That's not what you want. So it's respectful to your board members to keep a separation between the fiduciary and the manager, and it's just good governance.
Yeah, I do a lot of work with boards, and I think it's a much easier proposition to set things up appropriately on the front end, to set expectations, to have the right folks, to do the right education sessions, to be sure that you level set, than trying to course correct after that board is formed and maybe there are bad habits or not the right separations, et cetera. So I couldn't agree with you any more than that. Okay. Let's go to the next pitfall, and I see there is a question, and I think it'll fall nicely into one of our upcoming topics here and what remains of the webinar. So we'll come back to the question, but pitfall number 6, John, not contemplating canonical implications. I think you're on mute.
I'm no longer muted. I think that there are a number of canonical implications that are not always considered when creating a foundation or a trust or other entity. When you're creating a foundation and you're moving diocesan or community assets into a separate entity, you're alienating those funds. They are gone. So if you're taking $2 million from your seminary education endowed fund and gifting it to the foundation, that money's gone. And I think that there are certain canonical implications about the alienation of funds. I've asked about 8 canonists the same question, and I've gotten about 15 different answers about it, because there are requirements under the Code of Canon Law that when you alienate funds, the sale or the gifting of property, over certain amounts, you have to make an appeal through the congregation, or I guess the dicastery now for clergy, or the congregation for bishops. So I think that when you're looking at making these gifts, talk to a canonist, and maybe don't talk to the diocesan canonist. I think that unfortunately canonists are often forgotten in the world of civil corporations, and maybe there's some benefit to that. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're creating a Catholic entity that's in line with not only the civil laws of the state in which it exists, but with the Code of Canon Law that governs all Catholic entities, especially Catholic juridic persons.
Great. Thank you, John. All right, pitfall number 7, commingling assets with confusion of assets between foundations and the Archdiocese. And before we launch into that, I think this is a good spot to take the question, is there a recommended minimum dollar amount of assets and endowments before it makes sense to establish a separate foundation? Corey, do you want to take the question, and then we'll turn to Elizabeth to get us started on the pitfall?
Sure. There's, I tend to answer questions with questions. Maybe that's the 5 children in me. I haven't 5 children, but I tend to answer that question to be able to ask the question, do you have enough momentum and community support to be able to build a separate foundation? Because if it's just about the money, going back to John's piece, is it better in the trust? Is it better? There's certain things that are going to need governance, going to need attention, going to need management. And a certain amount, a dollar amount, may be able to, if you will, spit off enough for your own sustainability, having the interest of those funds to be able to help offset the cost of the staff, or whatever that is. And so sometimes there's a calculation like that. But what I've found more than anything is there a real community need for that? So answering that question more on where's the infrastructure of that foundation going to live, and is that really going to be of interest for the community and a benefit of the community instead of just a dollar amount? And so I know I'm not answering that question exactly, because I think in each community that number is going to change. It's not a dollar you get to that says, hey, you reach 15 million and you're going to be able to spit off enough to be able to get that person's salary met. And that's great. But having a staff for that foundation, just one staff, is that going to be the answer? So it's a little bit more complex than that. And I would say, how much desire is there for that? And answering that question, I think, is going to get you there a little bit better.
Thank you, Corey. Super practical advice, very useful. Okay, Elizabeth, commingling assets or confusion of assets between foundation and Archdiocese. How have you seen that pitfall play out?
Sure. I've seen this pitfall on 2 levels. One, with staffing. When you're sharing staff between the beneficiary and the foundation, or the diocese and the foundation, it creates an opportunity for gifts to be allocated improperly, or for practices that govern in the foundation to then be applied in the diocese, where that might not be the intention. So when you share staff, this becomes especially a pitfall, sharing staff in office spaces, right? But the question really comes down to where the gifts flow? Where does the money flow? And I think one pitfall is never to avoid going back to the donor and ensuring that a gift received is governed according to the donor's intent. So if a donor intends to give a gift to an operating fund for the diocese, but the check is written to the foundation, then rather than doing what would be convenient, deposit the check in the foundation and just write a check to the diocese, absolutely not. You want to go to the donor and say, we've got to do this properly. If this is a gift to the diocese, then I need you to rewrite the check. And a donor, 100 times out of 100, would always appreciate being reapproached to make sure that the gift goes where it was intended in the first place, rather than having their gifts swapped between entities and then become vulnerable to any sort of bankruptcy action or any sort of other legal consequence in the future. So keeping the intent of the donor sacrosanct in processing gifts is essential.
Thank you.
If I could just add to that, Paulita, while we're talking, I know it's kind of jumping in, but I can't stress that enough. As some of you may know, New Orleans is going through Chapter 11, and you look back at the conversations, and sacrosanct's a good word, because I think there's not only the donor intent regarding those kind of things, but I think some of that, it just gets you get into a if you will, a laziness of kind of how those things kind of go back and forth, and you lose intentionality so fast in the day-to-day operations that you really need to claim that space to be able to say, hey, this is not just something. So like, for example, the conversation with the donor, so many people don't like what would be perceived as perceived as this idea that that they're going to have this tension with the donor, when the reality is there is so much better to have that conversation on the front end with the donor than to have to go back on the back end. And so it's really being able to forge your mind and say, you know what, it's best to have that conversation now, knowing that the implications at the end are just a nightmare.
Thanks, Corey. Glad you jumped in. So pitfall number 8, Zela, you've been so patient and hanging out here, but this one goes to you now. There's nowhere to hide. Pitfall number 9, not understanding your investments, or rather, this is pitfall 8. How do you see that?
Thank you, Paulita. Well, what a great discussion. And I would encourage folks to ask questions, even though we're running low on time. There are 3 main pitfalls that we see for not understanding your investments. Number 1, mission alignment. As we mentioned earlier at the start of this webinar, it is important to define the mission of the organization. It is equally important for your investments to be aligned with your mission, because to have transparency, like Corey was saying, and alignment is going to help with your donor engagement activities. Number 2, sophistication is very important. Make sure that your investment committee has several financial experts and there are no conflicts of interest. Like Elizabeth mentioned earlier in the governance section, your investment person cannot be managing the money at the same time, right? That's a conflict of interest. But why do you need investment experts? So that when you're looking at certain asset classes like hedge funds, private equity, these members understand some of the nuances of these asset classes. Third point I want to make is that you need to understand who you're working with and what type of firm your investment advisor is and the fees that you're paying. There are 3 main categories at a high level that we see out there. Investment management organizations like Catholic Investment Services, organizations that are incentivized to create Catholic products like us. Number 2, investment consultants like the Mercers, Cambridge Associates, Cap Trust of this world. These organizations are going to help with asset allocation, manager hiring, and other areas like defined benefit management or sometimes actuarial services. Third, but not least, we see a lot of regional local wealth management firms. Some of the committees, I feel that by hiring a local advisor that's close geographically is going to give them better customer service. These days with Zoom and corporate travel coming back, this is not going to be that as important, that geographic proximity. I would say most important question is, what is the right fit for the committee? Do you want to delegate decision-making? Do you have the skills in-house, or do you want to hire for it? My advice to you also is make sure to always understand the fees that you're being charged.
Zela, thank you. I will add to that, that when it comes to trying to understand investments, there are no such things as dumb questions, right? So you don't necessarily have to have a person on the committee that's been the chief investment officer of a large corp. You need people who are going to be curious, engaged, good fiduciaries, are not going to be afraid to ask questions, and are going to inform themselves when they don't understand things, because that is an important quality. Let's go to pitfall number 9, and we're going to stick with you, Zela, which is not investing wisely.
Okay, so 3 things I wanted to share. Number 1 is your corpus, which is your principal, right? Endowment assets are usually meant for long-term investments that are geared to sustain your institutions. Do not treat it like a bank account. Number 2, having the right asset allocation is key. We often see endowment portfolios that look like retirement accounts. And by that, I mean 60-40, 60% equities, 40% fixed income. And that allocation, hasn't done well of late. It's important to realize that endowments in most Catholic institutions have a perpetual lifetime horizon. Allocations should tilt more towards return enhancing strategies like equities, private market portfolios, etc. Like I said, the goal of an endowment is to maximize assets for the long term so that you can maximize your mission. Like our CEO Tomlin says, no margin, no mission. And last but not least, complacency kills. Make sure that the committees are open to learning about new asset classes, new opportunities out there, as the investment markets are always evolving. The mantra of, this is how we've always done it or always invested is not going to lead you to long-term success.
Excellent points. No, excellent points. I mean, on your last one on diversification and just understanding how different asset classes can correlate or not correlate and why that's important is really critical. John, coming back to you on the same topic, not investing wisely. How have you seen this pitfall play out?
I've seen a number of clients where they treat their endowment as though it's a rainy day fund. Your endowment's not a rainy day fund. Your endowment should be working for you. When you should be taking, if you have $1 million, you should be taking 4% of that every year, which is $40,000 to underwrite costs of programs. But I've seen a number of organizations, and I think this is very scary. They've got their funds in savings accounts. Well, over the last few years, if you had $1 million in a savings account, you've lost money because the rate of inflation is 5 times what that's making. So invest wisely and make sure that you have again, if the road to hell is paved, I'll add an addition to it. If the road to hell is paved with good intentions, the road to heaven is also paved with a good investment committee, a good audit committee, and a good governance committee. I think that you have to make sure that your money's working for you. That's the whole point of an endowment. Don't sit on your funds. Take that annual draw to help underwrite your budget.
Thank you, John. All right. And drum roll, please. Pitfall number 10, not paying attention to details. John, you've had the floor, so we'll stick with you, and then we'll ask Elizabeth to weigh in to round us out.
Sure. A number of organizations with very good intentions are just not governed properly because they've never understood what their mission is. And I hate to say this because I know that there's a number of religious on this call. Ecclesiastical governance and corporate governance are two very different things. And I've found in many situations, especially among religious communities, if the board is too heavily religious and not with enough professionals who understand governance, it becomes just a functionary of the community. And I think what you really want, if you're going to take your entity to the next level, you need a governing board of people who understand corporate governance and not ecclesiastical governance. And that's a major step forward. But I think know what your bylaws say and know what your institution is all about. And have a board that is not there because it's some type of honor or some, you're rewarding them for $1 million gift. Your board of directors is a working board. And if the institution fails, it's on their shoulders. And I think that's something that boards have to understand, that it's not on the staff, it's not on the diocese, it's not on the religious community. At the end of the day, it's the board of directors that takes the responsibility if an institution fails.
Elizabeth, what about the details?
The devil really is in the details, Paulita. So I jotted down just 4 details that when I name these details, it will open up kind of a Pandora's box of additional details to consider. And I'm doing this just to remind everyone who's on the call that there's no detail that's too little, and it's important to keep examining them. And I think when you examine the details and re-examine the details, it keeps us mission driven and mission focused, because you're able to ask the question of, well, how does this detail affect my mission? So as Corey was talking about at the very beginning of the presentation, drifting from mission happens when we fail to look at the details, when we get lazy about looking at the details. So 4 kind of details I jotted down to get right in your foundation from the start is your gift acceptance policy. What does that look like? Because that keeps you mission focused versus drifting to where perhaps money goes. And I can give an example. We had somebody from a military academy want to give a gift that essentially would inure to the benefit of the military academy. They just wanted to run it through an entity that I was working with. And we said, well, no, that really doesn't work because that's not within our mission. But if you're just following the money, then sure, you take the gift, but that didn't make any sense. Second is honoring gift restrictions. And this comes down to just donor relations and transparency with your mission. Third would be a detail that people might not like to talk. It's easy to talk about on the front end, hard to talk about on the back end. Is board term limits. You never want to be in the position of saying, dear so-and-so, thank you for serving on this board for 10 years, but we decided we're not, going to ask you to continue to serve. But if you have board term limits, then you come to a natural conclusion of that, where you can always renew. And the fourth detail I jotted down is essential is the finance policy and the audit, and taking the audit seriously and implementing any recommended changes and really going above and beyond, not just for compliance sake, but foreseeing opportunities, risks, threats in your entity. So those are just 4 details: acceptance policy, gift restriction, board term limits, finance policy, and they can take you in any direction. So the details are always important and vast.
Boy, those details could be the launching pad for the next webinar. There's so many. Well, I will turn it over to Zela in a second to wrap up the webinar. But Corey, I don't want to end this without giving you an opportunity to weigh in here. If there's anything else about details you'd like to flag.
No, just I just want to affirm, I think all these comments are not only so poignant, but to be able to go back, and I know sometimes it can be overwhelming. So I would end it with just a word of encouragement. Don't get overwhelmed by it so that you don't do it. Start breaking your committees off and asking them, say, look, I heard this webinar. I want to be able to kind of navigate these. Can you go over these 10 pitfalls with me? How can we kind of start checking these off? So just giving you some encouragement to really do this in a way that's bite-sized pieces, but knowing that once you start getting momentum, once you start getting a committee member, a board member that buys into this vision that you have, and you can get your foundation staff on, it makes the world of difference. So just all the encouragement to do it.
Great advice, Corey. Thanks so much. Great way to wrap up. Zela, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Corey, John, Elizabeth, Paulita. This was a really, truly wonderful discussion. Truly appreciate it. There's going to be a quick audience survey feedback as you leave the webinar, so please take two seconds to complete it. We really appreciate it. And also, if you have any feedback for us for future webinars, I know in the Q&A I just saw a good one that somebody suggested. We'll take that into consideration. Please feel free to email us with any questions you may have at info@catholicinvest.org. Thank you for joining us today, and please be healthy and safe. Bye-bye.